Today I'm going to talk about the easiest proof for the existence of God.
Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
When I say the easiest proof for the existence of God, what I mean, I should be clear, is among the proofs of natural theology. Natural theology being that branch of philosophy wherein you can reason from the creation to the creator. So St. Thomas famously gives 5 in the Summa Theologica. You can also find a book by Edward Feser called 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, where he only uses one of those proofs from St. Thomas and uses 4 other proofs. Does it in a fairly different way. There are more than a few proofs for the existence of God where you reason from the creation to the creator. Properties of the creation that tell you that it is in fact a creation of a creator. And so they range and have a lot of different properties. And some of them, my favorite, this is not my favorite, by the way. I've got a separate video. I don't know if it's going to come before or after this one, but I've got a separate video on what my favorite proof is. However, my favorite proof is not by any means the easiest of the proofs. The easiest of them I'm going to describe now. The easiest of the proofs, and this comes from St. Thomas's 5 proofs for the existence of God, it is actually his 5th proof for the existence of God. It's the proof of God, that God exists from the governance of the world. Now, this is a very misunderstood proof for the existence of God in later days, for reasons I will get into. First, I want to describe what it is, then I'll talk about why it is generally not understood, and how it should, in fact, be understood, and why, properly understood, it is the easiest of them to grasp. The one that requires, when I say easiest, to a great degree what I mean is the one that requires the least previous learning in order to understand what the proof means. And why it's true. So, the way the proof runs from the governance of the world, that if you look at the world, it is very obviously governed. It does not merely proceed in a completely random way, but rather proceeds according to some sort of natural end. And it works towards this natural end, not just in random ways, and therefore it is governed because, of course, the tendency of things that are ungoverned is not towards any particular end. Okay, natural end, by the way, in the sense of like you can see it most easily from tools, that the end of a hammer is to hit things, but especially to drive in nails, and the end of a screwdriver is to turn screws, to drive screws. In tools that human beings make, the end is very easy to see, but in natural things, these also follow towards ends. Like, for example, there can be more than one, of course, as well. A hammer, for example, is used for driving screws, but on the flip side, usually what is technically a claw hammer is the claw that you can use to pull it. So the tool has 2 ends to drive things in and to pull nails out. So in like manner, you can look at something like a mouth, which has multiple natural ends, one of which is to chew food, one of which is, human beings, to breathe air, one of which is to speak, and so on. So these things have multiple ends, things towards which they are fulfilling the purpose of their being. Now, if you look at the natural world, and it's just really very intuitive, frankly, that when you look at the natural world, it is not sheer chaotic randomness. It is not, and when I say sheer chaotic randomness, people do have a tendency, this isn't the main problem, but people do have a tendency to look at it and say like, well, the animals are just wandering around. Yeah, but they're animals. They aren't just like plasmas. They aren't just gases. They aren't mere rocks. They actually are things that have natural ends, and they operate in ways that interrelate and work together. And this the way I just put that foreshadows what the answer to the common objection will be. So we're going to get there soon. So to some degree, this doesn't really need any explanation. Just look at the world, and the world obviously looks made. It has so many different things that interoperate and fit with each other and work together, and it's not just a mass of chaotic randomness, that to some degree it's just plain old obvious. However, the modern world has managed to get away from this obviousness by way of what you can loosely call, I mean, to some degree it started with Charles Darwin, though not exactly with Darwin, but in the theory of evolution. And the theory of evolution, by the way, I want to be very clear on this. I'm not saying the theory of evolution is false. The theory of evolution is actually entirely irrelevant to this proof. If anything, when you properly understand the theory of evolution, it actually strengthens the proof. Again, I'll get to this in a little bit. I just want to point to where we're going. The theory of evolution. Now, by the way, it's really important to distinguish here the scientific theory of evolution, which is the thing that is that I don't doubt, that seems to be an excellent explanation for the proximate cause of the origin of species, to the degree that you can define species well in a scientific sense, but that's a separate debate. That in a purely scientific one, by the way, so not relevant here. And also that's the one that strengthens the proof. There is another thing which gets called the theory of evolution, which is more properly an atheistic creation myth. The atheistic creation myth, which is sort of vaguely related to the scientific theory, is in no way identical with the scientific theory. And I'm going to be talking about it because it's actually the atheistic creation myth that is the thing that really causes problems in the modern world, not the scientific theory. To get there, however, we need to start with the scientific theory so that we can talk about what the actual theory, the real theory of evolution is. And then once we look at that, we will then be able to see the distinction characteristics of the creation myth version of the theory of evolution. So and hence the answer to the objection, etc. So what is the scientific theory of evolution? Well, it's a little bit hard to define in a useful way, because there's the standard theory of evolution, which is that you have changes in allele frequency in a population over time, doesn't really mean very much in ordinary English. It's specialized terminology and means something in the specialized terminology. What does this mean in practice? In practice, it means that, and it's actually, by the way, even that definition is a little bit outmoded because epigenetics is increasingly understood, or we're starting to gain an understanding of epigenetics. So when you talk about alleles are portions of genetics. They're portions of your DNA. But the thing is, your DNA is not the only thing. For those who don't know, DNA is essentially long strings of base pairs. Then within at least, the eukaryotes, the multicellular organisms. I forget if prokaryotes do a little differently. But anyway, within us, we've got the DNA, and then what you do is you come over, and there are these complex proteins that take in the building blocks of RNA, and then read the DNA, essentially, and create strands of mRNA, messenger RNA, that get used from the, off this, they go over the ribosomes, where they are then used, and then there's some other cellular machinery which then has these amino acids which have an appropriate sort of thing that can link up to the mRNA, and then it does that, and then it this places the amino acids in the appropriate sequence, in which, because there are about 26, I believe, amino acids used in I forget if it's all life or all multicellular life. I'm a little bit tired at the moment, but effectively, for the moment, close enough to saying all life. So you get the right sequence of amino acids, these things get joined together, they break off from this structure that was doing this, and now you have a protein. This is how DNA codes proteins, and it's proteins that actually go and do things. There's an asterisk on everything having to do with biology. But that said, I'm not saying mRNAs literally never do anything but this, because biology is weird and strange and complex, and there tend to be exceptions to every rule. But that said, in the main, this is how you get proteins, and proteins are the things that actually go and do stuff. Proteins catalyze reactions, they form structures, they do other stuff, they whenever you're doing anything in any sort of multicellular organism, for the most part, it tends to be based on proteins. If it's not a protein, it's something that a protein assembled. However, so that's how DNA produces proteins. And so as DNA changes, you get different proteins. The proteins can be made differently. You can get different proteins. You can have multiple copies, which tend to make more of proteins that have an effect. There's another problem, though, that was not originally very well understood, and we've come to understand better, which is this is an oversimplified, well, obviously it's oversimplified because it's biology, but in any event, this is an even more oversimplified model than many in biology, because it turns out there's the question of how do these proteins that go and read the DNA decide what they're going to actually read, like where they start and where they end and what they do and so on. And it turns out there are factors in the cell that control which portions of the DNA actually get expressed. And this is called epigenetics, the stuff around the genetics. And so it's not merely a question of what is the DNA, but how does the cell choose to express the DNA that has a significant effect on what actually happens, and eventually many, many layers of complexity higher on the phenotype, that is to say, the actual appearance, behavior, etc., of the animal that is constructed in this fashion. So, it's not even enough to talk about the change in alleles being portions of DNA. It's not enough to talk about the change in allele frequency in a population over time, because you can have changes in the epigenetics of a population over time that influence things, that influence like how big and strong, etc., whether or not you develop certain organs, etc. I'm massively oversimplifying. Anyway, so this is, so bearing in mind this hideous complexity of biology to properly understand the theory of evolution, it is really, properly speaking, that in a population over time, the frequency of sections of the DNA will change, as well as things like sections of the epigenetics that chooses how it's going to express the DNA will change over time. And the next step is, so the next question is, how do these things change? And the answer is actually in a variety of ways. There isn't just one answer. So there are some useful ways of looking at how these things change, but one that cannot be neglected is sheer chance. It turns out, and it's really easy to do if you're a programmer. I'm a professional programmer. If you're a programmer, it's really easy to write a model of, to model out essentially unexpressed genes and see that they can come to dominate in a population or disappear in a population without any sort of selective pressure. So again, it gets more complicated than this. And it's kind of important to bear that in mind, because one of the things that influences the change in the change in, I'm going to just call it the change in populations for simplicity. Change in populations over time is straight up chance. From the perspective of the animals, or, any sort of narrow perspective like that we have, rather than a truly global perspective, straight up luck and chance plays a role in how populations change over time as well. But one of the big things that does influence this is that anything which has a tendency to kill the organism off tends to not be passed on before it can reproduce, generally doesn't get passed on. And so there tends to be a selective pressure against things that kill animals off before they can reproduce. So you see that sort of thing. That's a selective pressure. These selective pressures then generalize to things that tend to, in the particular environment, result in more offspring, will tend to be things that spread in a population more as you get the more offspring. None of this stuff can ever be said with any sort of certainty. You can only ever say things like things that tend to, and so on, because to really look at the theory in full, it's too complicated. But, and here I'm wrapping it up. I realize it was long, but it's important to understand just how complex the theory of evolution really actually is, in order to be the full scientific theory of it. And one of the things that can happen is over time you can get these changes in a population such that you can then get things like you can get sufficient changes over time in a population such that it now becomes has a large enough aggregation of changes to become distinct from other populations that it started off from, for example. And so this is where you can get something like speciation, where one species can turn into two species, or one species can turn into another species, where you get this changes in populations over time happening. Now, sometimes these changes are really fast, sometimes these changes are very slow. Sometimes these changes are sometimes they are building new things. Sometimes they're simply subtracting stuff. Like you can have a move towards albinism in a population simply because for some reason, like a gene to produce melanin breaks, and then that propagates through the population, and then you can get an albino population for whatever reason. And there's a lot of stuff when you look at the actual historical record for which changes in populations have no obvious explanation. So there are all sorts. So there are occasionally changes that you can describe where it's kind of obvious why this change happened. That temperatures got colder and the population moved to having more fur. That you can at least come up with an explanation that sure as heck makes sense to you. There are lots of changes when you actually look at them in particular species at particular times where why did this thing shift in this way? Who knows? Things getting bigger, things getting smaller, things changing patterns, things going on. There are all sorts of things where, like a really interesting question, why is it that the pattern of having 5 digits is so incredibly common amongst animals? It's not, by the way, all that particularly hard to make a 6th digit. I mean, there's a condition called polydactyly in human beings where you can get some amount, and it varies with how useful it is, but some amount of a 6th finger, even in human beings. There's some cats where polydactyly is actually pretty common. But if you look around, lizards in general have 5 digits on hands and feet. These can vary quite considerably, by the way, and then there are various animals where like digits kind of like migrate up a little bit. So like birds very often have 4 toes, but there is this tiny little spike if you look higher up on their leg that, by the way, the wrist, morphologically speaking, often stretches out and will look like this because it can narrow and stretch out, and then it looks like you have toes just coming off the end of like a leg, whereas it's actually a wrist, and that's why the little spike can be higher up. The dew claw on a dog, for example, is that because dogs stand on their tippy toes. So they stand on this portion gets really elongated. This portion actually gets much smaller, and then the dew claw, which is why they have 4 claws on their back feet on the front feet, is much higher up. It doesn't touch the ground. But still, you get this basic pattern of 5. You see it all over the place. You see it in the lizards. I mean, often they have like one short, and then their longest toe on their back legs gets really long. So they get a weird look to it. But nonetheless, they have this, and you look around, and it's like, why is it 5? Like, it's not like there's any particular, intrinsic reason why 5 is like the best number to have, and why 6 is a terrible number. It's not like you can't produce it; it can be produced. And yet, when you look at birds and reptiles, and animals and so on, occasionally people get rid of them. Like horses have like essentially one toe; they're standing on like one toe. That and the rest of them became these like tiny little vestigial bones, essentially. They have one giant toe. So occasionally you shrink down, but they never increase. You don't really find anything with 6 fingers. Why? Well, there isn't really good reason. And interestingly, if you go back a few 100 million years, we're all kind of descended from one thing that had 5, but like a lot of the fossils around that time would have anywhere from, I think it was like 3 to 9 digits coming out of their hand. Hands and feet, roughly speaking. They're all kind of lizard-like animals, but this is like 350 to 400 million years ago, something like that, where there's a wide diversity in the number of digits, and then somehow, for some reason, you just see the number 5 after that. Why? I mean, obviously, it doesn't have to be. And here's the thing where there isn't actually a good explanation. I mean, you can make up explanations, of course, that like, well, 5 is the ideal number because it lets you do things, 4 is actually great, but you have a spare, but having 2 spares would be worse for some reason. Yeah, and this is, actually, by the way, we're now trending in the direction of the creation myth of evolution. If you actually look at the scientific theory of evolution, there become tons and tons and tons of things where the reason why it is like this is because that's the way it was in their ancestors. And in some cases you can see like, okay, it was useful in their ancestors and we can't see why it's useful here. Sometimes it's Yeah, who knows why it's like this? It just was, and it's preserved. It's been preserved over time. This is not changed, so maybe there's some selective pressure for it, or maybe it just has changed. Or another common thing, which would be tempting, except for polydactyly being the case, but you do see this in other stuff. Like, why are people never born with three eyes, for example? And the answer is the pathways necessary to produce the two eyes are sufficiently different from something that would be needed to produce three, that if you vary off of this path a bit, you tend to be fatal. So you will get these sorts of things you might loosely describe as like evolutionary ruts, where you happen to have arranged here, and then the method of being here is so complex that any sort of reasonable variation off of it tends to just kill you. And so you don't see it changing because there is no really good way of changing from it based upon where it's gone. You see that an awful lot too when you look at changes in species over time and why things are preserved. A lot of them tend to have that sort of curious feature to them of like, why don't you see people with 4 eyes or 6 eyes? Works great for spiders, why not for people? It'd be nice to have eyes in the back of your head. Why not? And the answer isn't, oh, eyes in the back of your head would be terrible, or eyes on the side and the front would just be so terrible that nature will they're all selected against. Actually, no, it's just, if you try to actually make these changes to make it happen, you tend to just kill the offspring. And so there's no good way of doing it. And because there's no good way of doing it, you're just kind of stuck where you are. You get that an awful lot in the actual scientific theory of evolution, where you just look at changes in species over time and how would you get from point A to point B, and if you can't get there, well, you're not going to go there. Because you won't do what you can't do. That's what the real theory of evolution looks like. Now, from here, we've gotten a popular creation myth of evolution that goes somewhere along the lines of within a population, the best, the strong, the biggest, strongest, fastest, smartest, etc., will do better than the smaller, slower, dumber, whatever. Or occasionally, the bigger isn't always there, but like smarter, stronger, faster, etc., tends to be within the creation myth. That like these things will enable you to do better in your environment as you adapt better to your environment. Also things like, some environments want bigger beaks and some environments want smaller beaks, and some environments you do really great if you just like grew feathers and could fly. And so whoever's closest to having feathers, they do better. And whoever's got the biggest beak does better, and so then they pass on these big beaks, and then so on and so on. That's the kind of popular theory, or the atheist creation myth of evolution. And so as nature selects for the biggest, strongest, fastest, the best in all cases, it always selects for the best. That what you get is this continual progression of things getting better and better and more fit for their environment, and this progression of whatever you need, whatever the closest thing to it is, the one that then moves in that direction and keeps moving in that direction and keeps moving in that direction until finally they get there. And this is the origin of species. And it superficially sounds kind of similar, except the problem is it's not the way things actually work. Things often get slower and dumber and all sorts of other things that are negative in this sort of sense. And they don't always even get more fit for their environment. Sometimes you just get stuff where like it gets weaker because it did. And like, there you are. There's no good reason for it to have been weaker. It wasn't better being weaker, but it wasn't sufficiently worse given everything else that happened that like, well, here you are. And so that's what actually can happen. And you can find historical records of things like the giant panda, which really is in many ways a truly pathetic animal. A strange modification of a bear into this weird vegetarian that can barely, that isn't very good at what it does because it's eating a terrible food. And they eat a heavily protein diet based on which part of the bamboo they select, but basically they only eat bamboo, and they're really bad at it, and they reproduce terribly, and there's no actually good. No, there are entirely legitimate scientific explanations for how did some bear at some point in this environment evolve in this direction to be the modern pathetic animal we know as the giant panda. And I'm just saying, from an evolutionary perspective, if you need massive amounts of help to succeed, and even with massive amounts of help, people can barely keep your species alive, you're not very impressive. So in the atheist creation myth of evolution, things like the giant panda really should not exist. And the way it tends to go is that it's the natural order of things, that everything gets better and trends towards perfection in this way over time. And occasionally you get like a natural disaster, like I can't remember the one. The asteroid that hit in the Gulf of Mexico and may have been responsible for ending the dinosaurs. That one. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't remember the name of it. Anyway, that one. Every now and again you get a setback like that because, sometimes stuff happens. But basically, by and large, natural selection produces this march to perfection and everything's just wonderful. That, for the most part, now, no one will actually phrase it in quite that stupid a manner, but by and large, that is in fact what the atheist creation myth is. And whenever you see people who are talking about this, what they always do is I think it's what Dave the Distributor's called the Hitchens two-step, but more or less, they will invoke the dumb idea, which they actually believe in, until you challenge them on it. Then they will defend some other idea that kind of plausibly sounds similar, but won't do any of what they want until you stop attacking them. Then they go right back to to using the thing the dumb idea that they never defended and couldn't defend because it is obviously false. This is what tends to happen. It makes it very difficult because if you ever challenge them on the problems with their idea, they always immediately defend something else, at which point you will try to point out that this won't do what they want, and then they'll forget about it and go back to their idea that actually does. And they keep on flipping and flopping between these two different theories. The one is obviously wrong and does what they want, and the other is defensible or even true but doesn't do what they want, and it gets kind of frustrating. You also need if you have a terrible memory, then this gets really hard. But if you have an even slightly decent memory, you'll notice the contradictions in what they're saying as they do this. They, however, will not. And then they'll get really, really angry at you as you try to clarify this stuff with them. And it's kind of unfortunate. That's always been my experience of it. Anyway, so the point being here, just as a small caveat, none of them will ever admit to what I have described as the atheist creation theory of evolution. They just use it. And when you actually challenge them on it, they always defend something much closer to the scientific theory of evolution that doesn't in any way do what they want. And here's why the real scientific theory of evolution in no way does what they want. There is nothing whatever in the scientific theory of evolution that explains why multiple sets of animals should be in balance with each other. So one of the easiest ways to see this, the gray goo scenario that you see in science fiction, where somebody made self-replicating nanobots that eat everything and reduce it into raw materials that they then produce more of these self-replicating nanobots. And before long, since they eat absolutely everything, they will have marched over an entire planet, turning every feature on the planet into nothing but this gray goo of self-reproducing nanobots. Okay, scientific hypothesis. The thing is, we have self-reproducing nanobots. They're just called bacteria. They're not based on silicon. They're based on carbon, and so we they're alive rather than being machines, and we call them bacteria rather than self-reproducing nanobots. But they're the correct size. They eat approximately anything that is actually edible. The problem with the self-reproducing nanobots too is there are a lot of things where you're not going to be able to extract energy from them. So you're gonna have a very hard time squeezing energy out of a rock. It's just that the bonds in it are in a very, very stable state from which you're going to have one heck of a time extracting energy, chemical energy. And at that size, you're not going to be able to extract nuclear energy by fusing the elements together. And most of them are not made of fissile material. So good luck taking a rock and then deriving energy from this rock in order to consume it. That part of the gray goo theory aside, you can only eat edible things, and that's true even of technology. But you can power a machine from an external source in order to go and break down something like rock, obviously, but not in a self-replicating sort of sense. They need they need to be eating power sources. They need to be getting additional power as they're more nanobots. So it's the problem. But if you make that little change that you can only eat edible things, we very much have them. They're called bacteria. So why haven't they produced a gray goo scenario? Why isn't there some bacterium that has developed the appropriate sort of proteins that can just eat everything? No, not necessarily each other, but everything but each other. And then, the world becomes nothing but this bacteria. And anything that varies away from it would then become eaten by the superbacteria. So why isn't that? Why have we not hit a stable state of nothing but bacteria? And if you bring this up, you will almost invariably get the answer because this exerts a selective pressure where other bacteria will then figure out how, the bacteria that can defend against this will then be selected for, and they will become the dominant, they will then, evolution selects for them, they will evolve in that direction, and then they will counterbalance them. Yeah, but why? This is the problem. Yes, in practice, that is what actually happens. We don't have a gray goo scenario because anytime anytime a plant becomes an uneatable plant, some animal goes and actually figures out how to eat the thing. Anytime something becomes a predator that prey can't escape from, well, they change and become able to escape. And so you don't have, because in large multicellular stuff, you could have, a hyperline that can kill and eat anything. At which point, they reproduce like crazy. They would kill absolutely everything. Nothing would ever get away from them. They'd have no problems right until their food supply utterly collapsed as the number of hyperlions, within this hypothesis, expanded and expanded. They'd be killing more and more until the entire population of food was eaten, at which point their prey would all be gone and they would starve to death. So why doesn't something like that happen? Why don't you get a plant that is able to poison every plant around it all over the place, kill all the plants? There's nothing but this one plant. Why don't you get a plant that has poisons that will kill any animal and that no animal can defend against? Why don't you ever have any of these things that do what actual chaotic systems always do? Because what do chaotic systems do? Chaotic systems always devolve into a stable state. If you have a plate spinning on a stick, eventually what happens, if you don't come and change the thing again, is the plate falls off. When you have large, complicated things in balance, what happens? Falls down. And then you can't fall off the ground. So you stay there. Look at any chaotic system, any genuinely chaotic system, any system where you can guarantee there is no outside influence, preserving the thing in a complex state. And what do those chaotic systems do? They always devolve into simple, stable states. But nature is not in anything like a stable state. The fact that you have many, many different kinds of bacteria at war with each other, and at war with multicellular organisms, and multicellular organisms at war with each other. If I'm trying to eat you, I very much am at war with you. Even if population-wise our numbers become relatively stable. Like, I'm trying to kill you, and you're trying to get away, you're trying to not be eaten in any manner that includes killing me. And just look at all sorts of big game, and look at how dangerous it is. And consider that there are plenty of lions who get killed by something like a wildebeest kicking back and hitting it in the head and crushing the lion's skull. Hunting is not a safe activity. These two things are very happy to kill each other. They are at war with each other. So why do you have this whole system where you have this war of all against all, roughly, at least at the species level, and nothing ever wins? Billion years, roughly, we've had life. 1.2 billion, I think, is the oldest traces of life we've found, something like that. And you don't have winners. Somehow there's been this billion-year conflict and nothing's ever won. How do you have this chaotic, unstable system that has remained balanced this entire time? And there is absolutely nothing in the real theory of evolution that says you should ever have such a thing. There is precisely zero reason, and given that things get stuck on ruts, there's precisely zero reason there shouldn't be a poison that will kill all animals, and so plants can just put this in their leaves and be eating free for there until the end of time, as everything that eats from their leaves dies. No reason that can't happen. No reason you can't have an animal that can just mow down everything in its sight. There's no reason any of these things should not have won. And yet, despite the fact they are all in a continual arms race, nothing ever wins. It maintains a stable state in which the world continues along being vastly more... I'm sorry, it's not a stable state. Maintains an unstable state in which the world... It is, in some sense, stably in this unstable state. And that is the thing that very clearly demonstrates governance. Because if you take an unstable state that should not last, that should devolve into some much simpler state, and it stays complex, and it stays interesting, and it stays interesting over time, and every time there is a change, there are counterbalancing changes that keep the thing in the interesting state, where it never devolves into the boring state. That is the sign of governance. Whenever you have something that stays in an interesting, unstable state that it should not be able to maintain on its own, and any time you see changes, and every time you see changes, you always see counterbalancing changes that then adjust the system so that anything that gets added, other things change always to balance this thing out. That is a governed system, because things that are ungoverned don't do that. They degenerate into stable, steady states that are boring. So that is why this is why the theory of evolution, because the theory of evolution, the scientific theory of evolution, lends support to this, because you can see all sorts of things, evolutionarily speaking, that stay in ruts, that you can't just change. The theory of evolution, if you actually study the history of how things have evolved, shows that animals are very, very far, plants, animals, etc., are very, very far from infinitely malleable. You cannot simply change them as you want. They tend to have various things like ruts they get into, like how you don't have human beings with 4 eyes, or 3 eyes, or 5 eyes. Why you don't have all sorts of different things. Like, why don't we ever grow more arms? It sure would be handy to have an extra pair of, a little bit longer torso, extra pair of arms. That would be handy. If you actually look at how our arms are built, by the way, they're kind of barely attached to our skeleton. There's like the bone, the shoulder bone's up here, but like, your big shoulder bone literally just floating and attached by nothing but muscle. You could very easily stick some extra bones that were just floating and attached by muscle lower down and have an extra pair of arms. Straightforward to design, and I mean, this is why you see fantasy artists coming up with this all the time. Nice and easy, just stick some, you want to lengthen the torso a little bit, but other than that, pretty straightforward to like make room for the various musculature, stick the stuff on, away you go. Extra arms, very useful. Insects prove the extra arms are useful all the time. And yet it never happens. Why? Why does it never happen? Why do you never even see people with like little nub arms that like can hold something between them so you get at least a little bit of utility and then the nub arms keep on growing? Why do you never see anything like that? Because if you look evolutionarily speaking, you can't get there from here. It's a bit like being in New Jersey. If you've ever driven in New Jersey, there's a famous song, "You Can't Get There From Here in New Jersey." The road system is, to people who are not native to New Jersey, incredibly hard to navigate. But the theory of evolution is much, in fact, like that, where there are all sorts of things where there's no good way to get there from here, even though that should also be a viable place. What you actually have is something analogous to the steady state, where the amount of changes required to get from here to there take you through this long area of this does not work and just breaks. The real theory of evolution shows that all sorts of things are, that nothing is infinitely malleable, that you can't just make arbitrary changes to a system and expect it to work. Clearly doesn't actually happen. So why is it within all of the constraints that all of these animals, and plants and animals and bacteria and whatnot, are all under, given that there's so many things that you cannot change? And clearly, over the course of a billion years, you can see how these things can't change, and all this stuff that gets preserved because there's no real way of changing it. Why does nothing ever take advantage of being stuck in these ruts in order to defeat their enemies? Because the creation myth of evolution holds that everything's infinitely plastic, that it's infinitely malleable, that you can just change anything. So if you have any change here, you will get a corresponding change here. But the real theory of evolution shows there are plenty of things where if you have a change here, you can't change this thing. So why, given the real theory of evolution, has it worked out? Has it worked out so incredibly well? Why has it stayed interesting? Why don't we have the gray goo? It's because this chaotic system is not left to itself, but is governed. It's really, if you think about it, very obviously governed. And so, oh sorry, I didn't mean to hit the microphone there. And so, if you think it through, if you ignore the atheist creation myth, which is obviously false, it's got symbolic value to it, which is why it persists, but it's obviously false as an actual description of the world, in like a scientific sense. Then it, because that provides the answer, like, oh, you don't need governance because everything just sort of self-governs, because anytime you have a change, it will naturally induce a corresponding change in the other stuff. Yeah, but it doesn't actually work that way. That's just fake. It's not real. I mean, it's a nice sort of idea, like it's a pleasant sounding idea, it's just not actually true, and so it doesn't answer the governance of the world in any way whatsoever. I mean, it would answer it if it were true, but the problem is it's not. There are a lot of things that would work if they were true, but they're false. So this is why I say that the governance of the world is actually probably the easiest way, because it's a bit harder in the modern context where you have this creation myth that tries to answer this problem. But if you just look at the simple problem with the creation myth of it being false, it's then not an answer. And you see straight away, the thing about this world is that it really, obviously, if you learn anything about all of the various complexity that remains complex over time, you see that it really obviously actually is governed. Now, there's one other objection to this that you will see coming from atheists from time to time, and that is roughly something along the lines of, it's not governed how I would govern it, therefore obviously it's governed. It's not governed. To some degree, it's governed badly, and by hypothesis, God would be at least as good at me as this, and since I could do a better job, obviously it's not governed by God, and obviously it's not actually governed, and there's just something that simulates this governance. This is, well, the problem is this is actually, I've got a video about this, I don't know if I'll have published it by now or not, but a video on the problem with ex hominem arguments. Ex hominem meaning from the man. That I am arguing something about me, therefore something about the world. In this case, the argument is, I could do a better job than this, therefore the world is clearly not governed by someone at least as good as me. And since by hypothesis God would actually be at least as good as me, clearly it's not governed by God, is more or less the way this argument goes. But unfortunately, it drags the atheist himself in as a premise in his argument. Like he literally has made himself part of his argument. So unfortunately, the answer to this thing, because the rest of it's actually, it's valid. The problem is it's not sound. The premise is false. He could not do a better job than this. And unfortunately, there's no way to say that without insulting him. But unfortunately, he's the one who dragged himself into it, holding himself up as somebody who would actually be good at governing the world, when the simple answer is, no, he's not. He would do a terrible job. And it doesn't take very much at all, very much experience of human beings. It doesn't take very much experience of trying trying to govern pretty much anything to see how incredibly hard it is to actually govern things, because there are so many unintended consequences to everything that, human beings are really bad at governing anything. And the atheists are not some miracles of governance that, none that I've ever seen, that would actually be any good at governing the world. They'll pick like one very particular thing without reference to any of the things, like, oh, look, you've got this thing in the world, and I could have governed much better than that. I've made a better choice than that, without reference to any of its consequences, or any of, also consequences in both directions, like what would you need to have done to set up the decision that you think would be better, and what are the consequences of the decision that you think would be better. And they don't really know either of those things, so their statement that, like, I could have done that better, I could have made a better decision than this, is utterly and completely without any sort of foundation whatever. This is where it's kind of an odd thing to deal with, and this is just sort of an in practice if you're answering this sort of thing. Because the problem is basically it's the sort of know-it-all sort of attitude that young teenagers tend to have, like 13, 14, when they've learned enough about the world to start drawing conclusions, but not enough about the world to see why the particular conclusions they tend to draw are false. Not that teenagers are wrong about everything. They're often right about a lot of things. It's just they tend to be, where they're right, they tend to be in agreement with everyone else, so you don't notice as much. So teenagers, by and large, tend to be mostly correct in the conclusions that they draw. It's just that the conclusions they draw that are different from everybody else's conclusions have a strong tendency to be wrong, simply because they are made based upon such a small amount of information, a small amount of knowledge of the world. And what a lot of these atheists are doing, I mean, many of them even frankly are teenagers if you meet them on the internet. There's a surprising number of teenagers who sort of sound older than they are. I don't have hard statistics to back that up, but I've run into more than a few who sort of one way or another more or less admit to being in high school. And, you think you're dealing with an adult, you think you're talking to somebody in their like 30s or 40s, and it turns out that no, you're talking to somebody who isn't even 20 yet. And so it's a weird sort of thing when that comes up. But so there's like that, sometimes like the people you're talking to are just literally much younger than you think. But another aspect to it as well is a surprising number of atheists seem to be, there's a book I'm going to mention citing this, but seem to be more or less developmentally frozen as teenagers, where they, and this is often, there's a book called The Faith of the Fatherless. I haven't finished reading the whole thing, but it's very interesting and talks about how not having a father in your life, whether it can be an incredibly weak father, a father who's just never really around, or just straight up, like your father left or what have you. That these things are really actually surprisingly well correlated with atheism. And the thing they all have in common for the most part is they tend to force people to grow up really early. And the thing about growing up is that human beings come in kind of two stages. The early stage, where you're very malleable and changeable, and you're soaking up knowledge and understanding, and the elders of your species are teaching you. And then the later stage, where you enter into the adult phase of your life, where you are far less malleable and far less changeable, and because you need to be far more reliable. You can't be, as an adult, you are now subject to people trying to trick you into things, and so you have to be able to avoid being tricked into stuff. And there's a reason why tricking children is super easy. It's because that's the nature of a child, is to soak up what they're being told and to be trusting of it. Whereas an adult, you need to be much more independent than that, but the flip side of being independent is you have to be far less changeable. So, if you grow up too early, not in the biological sense of growing up, but like psychologically, if you grow up too early, what can happen is you can become unchangeable, or not unchangeable, but you can become far less changeable in that adult sort of phase before you have learned a large fraction of what you need to really soak up. And so you can be stuck in a kind of perpetual teenagerhood. This can happen a lot to children who have no father for various reasons that are mostly, they're sociological, but so a lot of the atheists that you'll find people who are in their 50s who sound like teenagers in the way that they talk. And for these people especially, this sort of argument of, I could do a much better job than this, is really very appealing because they have been stuck relying on themselves for so long. They tend to think of themselves as sort of an ultimate authority, that they could do everything well. These people also, it's a subset of atheists, I want to be clear here. Just a surprising number that you meet on the internet, or at least that I've met on the internet and talked to and so on. There are, as I said, it's a subset of them. Probably a bit overrepresented on the internet, but in any event, so when you're talking to such a person, they tend to get very, very wedded to this, I could do better. I could do better. I would do a great job. I would not make mistakes like this. Like, that's an obvious mistake. That's stupid. I could do so much better than that. It's got that teenagerish simplification to it. And how you deal with that, of course, you have to deal with the individual in front of you. To some degree, straight on challenging of this, like, no, you couldn't, is sometimes productive. Sometimes it's not. I mean, with a lot of people, there's nothing you're going to do, really. Like the most you're going to do is, like, maybe you'll be able to remove some of the rocks so that somebody else can till the soil, so that somebody else can plant the seed at some point. But there's something to be said, and sometimes something to be gained, something to be said for, and sometimes something to be gained by sort of working on establishing that sort of doubt in the tremendous competence of the person in front of you, that they could rule the world, they could run everything and do a good job of it. And that is, as I said, because this is an ex hominem argument, the person here making this argument has explicitly dragged themselves and their competence in as evidence for their conclusion. I would do a phenomenally better job than I see, therefore God doesn't exist. Depends. I mean, if that's true, if this dinky little human being here, with just 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes and whatnot, could do a better job of running the world than we see done, then yeah, it's actually a pretty good proof that God is not running the world. So it's valid, but it's not sound, and there aren't exactly many premises here. So there's only really one, actually, and it's the false premise that they could do a good job running the world. This is not easy to deal with because this tends to come with this bluster, and worse, because the person has invoked himself, and since the only way to defeat the argument is by what is, in effect, unfortunately, attacking them, pointing out that no, you wouldn't do any better than any of the rest of us, you would not do a good job, you would do a terrible job, if you were the ruler of the world, it would be a really, really bad world, is both necessary to answer what he has put forward, and also insulting. But unfortunately, if a person is going to make grandiose claims like he would do a good job running the world, well, there's no way for him to progress except by coming down a few pegs. Actually, a lot of pegs, but, So it's a bad situation to be in. If you encounter this argument, it's really unfortunate because there's no good way out of it. But unfortunately, logically, the only way out of this is essentially that the person you're talking to has presented you an argument that amounts to, I am proud, therefore God doesn't exist. And the only way he's going to get past this one is by not being prideful. And now, here's kind of one thing, because there are 2 types of mistakes you could be making. One type is of the intellect and the other type is of the will. If he is simply mistaken, then you can challenge that and you can help him to see past that. You can help him to see, like, wait a minute, I'm making the argument that I would actually be good at running the world. And obviously I have no idea how I would do running the world. There would be so many unintended consequences, it's basically not even plausible I could do a halfway decent job running the world. It's possible that pointing out to him what his argument really is may help him to see that he has based his argument for the non-existence on God on his own personal grandeur and magnificence. And if he hasn't realized that before, and you help him to realize that, he then can choose it, so that you can actually provide something useful. If it's rather the other way, if he already knows this and he's just sticking to it anyway, I know I'm saying that I could do a good job running the world, that I could do a better job than this. Even though I have such limited knowledge, I would still do a better job, even though there is no logical way I could possibly claim this. I still would do better. Well, at that point, what you have is a person not who needs to be convinced of anything, but a person who needs to repent of their sin of pride. And not pleasant to say, but that's what's actually going on, and you're not going to do anyone any favors by not dealing with reality. If you meet such a person, then arguments are not going to be helpful. You may, in the context, if this is a public sort of thing, want to present the argument of what the guy's doing, clearly that he is basing his rejection of God on his own magnificence, just for the sake of anybody who is watching this, so that may still be valuable. But other than that, the problem with this sort of argument, and I bring this up because I run into this a bunch, so this is not This is practical experience that I am relating, not pie in the sky stuff. If the person simply is going to stick to their own ability to run the world better than it actually is run, then there's kind of nothing to do at that point. That if a person is going to decide that they, in spite of all logic, are just so personally magnificent that obviously there is nothing better than them, which is what their argument boils down to, there's nothing to do at that point. Pray for them, obviously. Pray for everybody, but pray for them. And the other one is, roughly speaking, the sort of things that might help to soften a heart to repentance. So inviting them to help in doing good works. Because there is something about, doing good which can help to soften the will, even though there's no direct logical correlation, because the choices of the will are not, in this case, is irrational. So the lack of a logical connection doesn't matter because there isn't a logical thing driving the person to the bad choice. The also beauty. Sometimes beauty can help to soften the heart as well. But it's the general problem of anything, and it gets back to the old saw from the how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but the light bulb has to want to change. That's the problem you run into. I bring this up and I kind of go at it such length because I have had people, they come at you with so much vim and so much vigor, to use the Dr. Seuss term, but they come at you with so much confidence because, their fundamental problem is a wild overabundance of self-confidence, that it can be kind of a lot to deal with, and to fully understand what's going on is very helpful in dealing with this onslaught of this just sort of force of personality. I am magnificently confident, bow down before my confidence sort of approach. That has been very long in dealing with that other major objection that you will see. And I apologize it was so long, but it really, I think, is kind of necessary just because of how this tends to present and how difficult it can be to deal with. And that's why I really want to emphasize that the logical problem with it is that the person is, in fact, what they're doing is they are saying, essentially, I'm so great, therefore God doesn't exist. And it's hard to deal with. It's really hard to deal with. But for these reasons, it is not a valid objection, and it is, moreover, since it is not actually it's a valid but not a sound logical argument, you're left only with one way of dealing with it. So I hope this helps. As I said, this is what I think the easiest of the proofs for the existence of God. And I know it's a little silly to have a video this long about something being easy. It's because there are various ways people have of trying to muddy the waters, that I have a long video explaining why the waters, how to see through the mud that gets stirred up to, see it anyway. It's also one of, I think, helpful to anybody who is not experiencing the waters being muddied by somebody. It will then be one of the easiest because you don't have to sort of clear clear the noise, or get away from the noise to clear the obstructions. And so it will then be the easiest if there aren't the obstructions to clear away. Even if you do have to clear away the obstructions, though, I think the fact that it is not highly technical, and the also the fact that the answer to the objections is, so somebody's saying like, oh, science shows this isn't true. The answer to it is, well, learn real science, not your fake pseudoscience, but learn real science, and you'll see real science in no way is an answer to this. And so it's still very helpful, because if you help a person learn real science, one, they know more about the world that God created, and that's always good, to the degree that they can understand it. And two, it is appealing to the very same authority, just to the real authority, to what the authority actually proclaims, and therefore is fighting on the same ground, and therefore is a very useful answer. So, hope this helps, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.